the parliament is more common in Europe. Now we're going to move on to one final difference that makes the United States different from many, though not all, European countries, and that's that the United States has federalism. So, to define federalism, I think it's actually useful to start by defining its opposite. The opposite of a federal system is a unitary system, and that is one in which the national government is pretty firmly in control, right? Most of the policy decisions are decided and carried out by the national government. There might also be regional governments, but they largely exist to carry out the will of the national government. They don't play a big role in setting policy. So, for example, to use an extreme example from France, it said you could walk into any classroom in France on any day and know exactly what the lesson is because they have that very standardized curriculum all across the nation, whereas it's very different in a federal system. See what I did there? I moved. This is where national government shares power with different subnational units. There still is a national government that makes certain laws, but there are also these regional governments or subnational units of government that also get to make their own decisions on certain things. To stay with the education example, we have different states all with their own education systems, and there's actually limits to how much the national government can do to shape education policy. Now, let's think for a moment. Why might it be desirable to have a federal system? You might think about why this would come to be. I'll give you some answers. Some people would say each part of a country, especially one as big as the U.S., has a lot of regional diversity, and maybe what's good for one state won't be as good for another state, and so you should have different decision-making power housed in different places. Another would be you're sort of scared about the national government getting too powerful. In the case of the United States, this was certainly part of the reason why after the American Revolution they didn't want an overly strong national government. And then another one would have to do with kind of ethnic diversity. That is, if you have a country where there are different ethnicities, and there's one ethnicity that might be a minority group. The yellow on this map refers to the Kurds in Iraq. In that scenario, if they're I forget what the Kurds are, but it's 10-15% of the population. If that's the case, that group could get totally swamped in a democracy, right? If there's another ethnic group that's the majority, they could just pass laws that hurt the minority. However, in a federal system, which is what Iraq currently has, where the Kurds have their own little region and they get a lot of power over how that region is run, they can still run their own affairs according to their own desires, even though they're the minority in the country. Right? And so those are some of the cases for federalism. The downsides of federalism is that you can end up with a situation where a bunch of states are working at cross purposes, and there's downsides to that too. Anyway, here's the big point I want to make with this, though. In such a situation, right, in a federal system like the United States has, right, in which the national government shares power with a bunch of state governments, it creates a bunch of veto players. That is, you could have states who have ways to check what the national government does, and there are ways that the national government can override what state governments do. And that theme of veto players that we've seen throughout today will definitely be apparent, will be part of the situation when you have power divided between national and state level governments. To give you a sense in the United States, to give you a sense in the United States about how this works, think about how the coronavirus thing is being handled right now. You have Trump in Washington making certain decisions for the federal government, but he doesn't really have power over a lot of the decisions that are being made. In New York and Illinois and California, we have the governors of those states passing these laws about sheltering in place and saying that the school systems are closed. Trump and the national government can't uniformly make those decisions for all the states. That's because we have states that are acting, relatively independently from the federal government. I think I'm recording this on Monday. I wonder by the time you watch this whether things will have changed, because I can imagine a scenario by Friday, based on what's in the news right now, where we really start to get even more with the federal and state governments not being on the same page. But we'll see how that works out. So, in conclusion, I have reviewed these different parts of government. executive, legislative, and judicial branches. I've also reviewed how we have parliamentary systems and presidential systems, and they work differently, and there's a different relationship between the executive and the legislative in these different systems. I've also talked about federal versus unitary systems and how the US is different from Europe in that regard too. And here is a key overarching point. There are a lot of veto players in the US system compared to the European system, right? With a presidential system, the legislative and the executive branch are more likely to be at odds with one another. We have, and I didn't quite talk about this, but we have a particularly strong judiciary with a lot of power to overthrow laws passed by the legislative branch. We have very powerful state governments compared to a lot of European countries who also, that divides power between the nation and the states and creates these opportunities for conflict. And there's just a lot of different ways that different parts of the US government can kind of check each other's power. I will ask you to think of examples of this. What are some ways in which, right, we have different branches of government, states versus national government, legislative versus executive, prominent cases where the judicial branch overthrows something that the legislative branch does? Come to class on Monday with some examples of that, because I think it'll be useful to discuss. In the next video, we're going to be talking about election systems. That's another big difference between the US and Europe, so you can go on to that YouTube video next.